For months, the question of what to do with the hundreds of billions of dollars in frozen Russian assets held by the European Union or EU has been asked. Handing those funds over to Ukraine is out of the question, at least right now. The legal ramifications alone will be a nightmare for the EU. Still, the Union has been trying to come up with ways to help Ukraine benefit from this frozen money. Now it may have found a way. Europe has developed a shocking plan for Ukraine that could cripple Russia forever. However, that plan is far from perfect, and it may yet face opposition from those who will be expected to carry it out. On December 8th, the Kyiv Post reported that the European Commission, or EC, had come up with a way to use the 210 billion euros, or about $244 billion, in frozen Russian funds held in EU countries to help Ukraine. That money can be turned into an emergency loan for Ukraine, the EC says, and it will be guaranteed by some of the largest and most prosperous nations in the EU. France, Germany, and Italy will be among those guarantors, the outlet says, as the new plan determines guarantee shares based on gross national income, rather than which nation holds Russia's frozen assets. The idea behind the new plan is simple. With opposition still being expressed to the idea of using the assets to fund a loan to Ukraine, the plan intends to place the majority of the burden for guaranteeing the loan on the EU's largest economies. It's all about risk and which nations are readiest to absorb that risk. If the plan is approved, the loan package could be unlocked early enough to provide Ukraine with an influx of tens of billions of dollars throughout 2026 and 27, which will go a long way toward helping a nation that's had its economy shattered by Vladimir Putin's invasion. Ukraine could use that money with EU-agreed conditions and oversight, most likely covering a budget gap that threatens the country's ability to defend itself against Russia, seems like the highest priority. We'll come back to that budget gap later in the video. First, Politico offers more details about the EC's new plan. It says that Germany is said to be the main loan guarantor thanks to its powerful economy. It will be responsible for about 52 billion euros or around $60.5 billion of the loan on its own. That amounts to almost a third of the total loan, which Politico says will total 165 billion euros, or a touch over $192 billion. That still leaves several tens of billions of dollars in frozen Russian assets left over, which could mean one of two things. Either the EC wants to keep that money in reserve so that it can give something back to Russia immediately if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, or that money will be kept and invested over the next couple of years and partly used to back existing G7 loans to Ukraine. In this case, Ukraine will be able to take out yet another sizable loan if Putin's invasion lasts long enough to place it back in dire financial straits following the initial loan. Politico also discusses how the loan will be paid to Ukraine. It says that 115 billion euros, or around $133.8 billion, has already been earmarked to finance Ukraine's defenses. This is massive for Ukraine, especially as it's now benefiting from the US-backed Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, or PEARL, program. Under this program, Ukraine can purchase weapons from the US via EU nations, with the latter actually handling the purchases. On December 8th, the Russian news agency TASS quoted Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who revealed how much Ukraine needs from the EU for the PEARL program in 2026. The PEARL program needs $15 billion. As for this year, we were short of $1.5 billion, but the Netherlands allocated $700 million today. Now we are short of $800 million, Zelensky revealed. Of course, a loan to Ukraine doesn't help the EU nations cover this funding gap. However, it's possible that Ukraine could tell the EU to use $15 billion of the $133.8 billion it will receive under the EC loan plan to cover the PEARL payments. That would still leave almost $119 billion that Ukraine can use to fund its domestic weapons manufacturers, as well as buy weapons from its European partners to aid in its defense against Russia. As for the rest of the loan money, the EC says that it would go toward covering Ukraine's other budgetary needs, essentially providing the country with a more stable financial footing. Economically, that removes a weight from Ukraine's collective shoulders by ensuring that its public services and similar programs can continue running as the war with Russia goes on. Politico also mentions the remaining 45 billion euros, which appears to mean the money we mentioned earlier that the EC set aside. In addition to providing the EU with Russian money to hold onto in case of either of the eventualities mentioned, those remaining funds, which add up to about $52.3 billion, would be used to repay a series of loans issued to Ukraine by the Group of 7 nations in 2024. Ukraine also won't be receiving all of the money up front. The funds will be dispersed in 6 payments over the year, according to the Commission's slideshows, Politico reports. Certain checks and balances will be in place to prevent crooks from pocketing the money. In terms of defense spending, for example, this would include ensuring that the contracts and the spending plans are acceptable to the Commission. These mentions of checks and balances are important because Ukraine has been embroiled in controversy recently. In November, anti-corruption agencies unveiled a $100 million plot being carried out by some of Zelensky's close associates in Ukraine's energy sector. Those associates were essentially skimming money off the top of funding provided to that sector, enriching themselves even as Ukrainian citizens struggle with constant blackouts caused by Russian bombing campaigns. The EC wants to ensure that a similar scandal doesn't affect the distribution of the frozen asset loan. The approval processes that Politico mentions provide the checks and balances needed. There are a handful of caveats to the new scheme, however. For one, the three countries already mentioned aren't going to guarantee the entire loan. Germany, France, and Italy account for €110.4 billion, or about $128.6 billion of the loan, whereas the rest of the EU covers the remainder. Spain, for instance, will be expected to guarantee almost €19 billion, or $22 billion of the loan, with even smaller EU nations such as Latvia and Lithuania having to commit to multi-$100 million guarantees. The EC is hoping that the proportional nature of the split will make these guarantees easier to swallow for those nations operating on smaller budgets than the EU's major economic powers. Unfortunately, some of these smaller nations may be asked to guarantee larger parts of the loan if the EC proposal doesn't achieve a full consensus among the EU's members. As Politico points out, the per-country totals could rise if EU nations that are friendly to Russia, such as Hungary, decide not to participate. That is a definite possibility, and it would mean that €1.4 billion or $1.6 billion would need to be covered by the rest of the participants. However, the EC has also tried to get ahead of that potential problem by opening up its new plan to non-EU nations, which can cover parts of the guarantee if they so choose. Norway had been touted as a possible candidate for this part of the plan, though it has since distanced itself from the whole idea. The other caveat is one for which the entire plan seems to have been constructed: Belgium. When the idea of using the frozen Russian assets held by EU countries was first floated, Belgium was loud in its opposition to the plan, and it had a good reason to be worried. As the BBC points out, the majority of the Russian assets frozen in the EU are held at Euroclear, which is a central securities depository that is based in Belgium. If the loan had gone ahead in its original form, Belgium would have been on the hook for most of the guarantee, in addition to most of the responsibility from both the legal and Putin-angering standpoints. As Maxime Prévost, who is the Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium, said earlier in December, "If Russia takes us to court, it will have every chance of winning, and we, Belgium, will not be able to repay those €200 billion, because that represents the equivalent of an entire year of the federal budget. It would mean bankruptcy for Belgium." Belgium couldn't take the risk. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz met Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever to discuss the issue on December 5th, noting that Belgium had every reason to be concerned. Speaking after that meeting, Merz said, "We had a very constructive exchange on this issue. Belgium's particular concern about the question of how to make use of the frozen Russian assets is undeniable and must be addressed in any conceivable solution in such a way that all European states bear the same risk." With the new EC plan, the economic risk is now being spread in a way that places no individual EU state in a position where it would struggle to guarantee the loan. That may be enough for Belgium to give the go-ahead for the plan. And if it does, and the other EU nations approve of the plan, the two major caveats wouldn't be issues. However, other barriers exist, starting with the legal issues implied by Prévost when he mentions the possibility of Russia taking the EU nations that guarantee the loan to court. Let's start with the basic idea of seizing the frozen Russian assets. Arguments have been made that Russia should be forced to forfeit these assets as part of the economic punishments being meted out to the country for Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Though this may seem like the right thing to do morally, at least from a Western standpoint, seizing another country's assets isn't like sanctioning that country. With a sanction, a nation often essentially says that it won't do business with an entity within the country being sanctioned. That alone is legally complicated, as the UK's House of Commons Library explains. It says that any sanctions that a nation adopts outside of the United Nations Security Council have a complicated relationship with international law. Sanctions can either be legal exercises of a country's sovereignty or breaches of international law, depending on the nature of the sanctions and the justification provided for them. So the main economic tools that the EU is using to hurt Russia are already a little dicey. Seizing frozen Russian assets outright is controversial, but the debate is not nearly as closed as some suggest. International law does not automatically forbid confiscation. Rather, it requires that any such move be justified as a response to a serious breach of international law. And Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine is one of the clearest breaches in decades. If Ukraine held Russia's sovereign assets directly, the legal and political arguments for transferring them to Kyiv would be significantly stronger. Ukraine is the state that has suffered massive, ongoing harm, and international law grants an injured state far wider latitude to respond. As the Commons Library notes, if a state has been injured by another state's breach of international law, it can take countermeasures. These allow the state to temporarily take measures that would normally be unlawful to induce the wrongdoing state to stop its unlawful behavior and make good on its breach of the law. The challenge is that the frozen Russian assets are not in Ukrainian hands. They are in the EU, the US, and other allied nations. For these states, the legal pathway to confiscation is more complex but far from impossible. Russia's invasion has destabilized Europe, violated core principles of the UN Charter, weaponized energy supplies, and conducted cyber, sabotage, and disinformation operations on EU territory. Many legal scholars argue that this constellation of harms gives European states a credible basis to claim that they, too, have suffered injury under international law. That argument is gaining traction precisely because Russia's conduct is persistent, severe, and openly contemptuous of international norms. This is why increasing numbers of policymakers are pushing to move from freeze to seize. The political case is obvious. Russia has inflicted over $1 trillion worth of destruction on Ukraine. Justice demands that the aggressor pay, not the victim. The legal case, while innovative, builds on existing doctrines about countermeasures and state responsibility. Doctrines designed specifically to address situations where an aggressor refuses to stop unlawful behavior and refuses to compensate the injured party. The EU's loan mechanism represents a cautious step in this direction. According to the European Policy Centre, EPC, the proposal is a legally cautious workaround, but rests on an important principle. Even if the assets themselves cannot yet be confiscated, the profits they generate can be redirected as a lawful countermeasure. This is only possible because the underlying claim that Russia owes reparations remains intact. The EPC emphasizes this distinction. Countermeasures are not reprisals. They must be reversible and lifted once legality is restored. The Commission's design meets this test. In other words, the EU's plan keeps Russia's claim technically alive, but only until Russia ends its aggression and pays what it owes. If Moscow refuses to do so, the international debate will inevitably shift toward outright confiscation. Several countries, including the United States and Canada, are already drafting legislation to create a legal pathway for permanent seizure. There is little precedent for a mechanism of this scale, but that is because the crime itself, a nuclear-armed state attempting to erase a neighbor, is unprecedented in modern Europe. Russia will almost certainly challenge any attempt to repurpose its assets. That legal fight is unavoidable. But uncertainty alone is not an argument against action. It's a sign that the international legal system is being forced to confront a situation for which it was never fully prepared. If anything, the current moment is exactly when legal innovation becomes necessary. The aggressor should not enjoy stronger protections than the victim, and if the global community is serious about accountability, Russia's frozen assets will not stay frozen forever. They will flow to where they belong, rebuilding the country Russia tried to destroy. The point is that there are question marks about the EC's plan, even though the latest version allays many of the concerns expressed by Belgium. There are also hints already emerging that some of the nations that could take part in the plan are less than enthusiastic. The European Central Bank, or ECB, has already said that it will refuse to back plans to use the frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine in the form of a loan. On December 6th, the Kyiv Post reported that the ECB believes that this type of loan would violate several EU treaties. The EC President, Ursula von der Leyen, has recognized the ECB's concerns and is plowing ahead regardless. She's hoping that the new plan will be approved by a qualified majority of EU states, which would circumvent any veto attempts and make it so that ECB backing isn't required. Still, the legal issues raise their head again. Other barriers are being presented by one of the nations that is pivotal to the EC's plan coming together. On December 8th, The Telegraph reported that France has blocked the release of some of the frozen assets that it holds for Russia, which throws the entire EC plan into jeopardy. Around 18 billion euros, or almost $21 billion of the assets, are held by France, and the country is refusing to disclose the exact whereabouts of the money. French officials have cited confidentiality rules as the reason why they won't provide access to the bank records needed to access the funds, which harkens back to the ECB's concerns about the legality of the EC's new plan. This is market-sensitive information. It's the same as if doctors would be publicly discussing medical records, an EC spokesperson said, and these privacy concerns could end up being a major hurdle. If they do, France may end up in the firing line. Though it has publicly backed the use of frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine many times, it now seems to be standing in the way of the latest plan that would make that happen. French President Emmanuel Macron could face criticism for this decision, especially as he has positioned his country at the forefront of efforts to help Ukraine ever since Putin invaded. At the very least, he'll be called on to offer a defense of his country's decision, and privacy concerns may not cut it in some quarters of the EU. Other countries outside of the EU have also expressed concern about the EC's plan. We mentioned earlier that the plan opens the door for non-EU nations to serve as guarantors if they choose. Furthermore, the plan seems to offer other countries that host frozen Russian assets a chance to follow the EC's lead. Japan has already been asked, Politico reported on December 8th, and it said no. That country holds about 25.7 billion euros, or around $30 billion in Russian assets, and it isn't about to join the EC's plan. That may have less to do with the legal concerns surrounding the plan and more to do with the US opposition to using Russia's assets to help Ukraine, Politico reports. It appears that Japan is more concerned with maintaining its relationship with the US than it is with putting itself at risk to help Ukraine. Only time will tell if Japan maintains that stance. Russia has responded to the deliberations over the EC's plans in the only way that it knows how: mockery and vague threats. On December 4th, just a few days before the latest plan was revealed, Reuters reported that Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova said, "Any illegal actions involving our assets will not go unanswered. Preparations for a package of countermeasures in the event of actual theft and seizure of Russian Federation assets are already underway." In this case, the countermeasures being mentioned may be legal challenges rather than outright attacks. The concern for the EC in Ukraine is that Russia may actually have a solid legal basis for challenging the EC's new plan. But let's assume that all of these barriers disappear. The EC's plan is approved, all EU nations support it, and the threats for Russia are ignored. How important would the new loan be to Ukraine? As we hinted earlier in the video, the loan being discussed within the EU right now would be massive for Ukraine because the country faces a lot of financial hardship caused by Putin's invasion. Ukraine's economic challenges have been in the news for much of the latter half of 2025, with a September piece by The Economist highlighting the country's major issues. Though Ukraine has achieved between 2 and 2.4% economic growth in 2025, at the time the article was written, that growth is primarily on the back of defense and tech firms that are serving the war effort more than they are Ukraine itself. Ukraine's more pressing problem, the outlet says, is that tax and domestic borrowing are only enough to cover Ukraine's military spending, which amounts to 2/3 of the country's budget. You can see the issue here. There's another third of that budget that needs to be covered, with The Economist claiming that even the rosiest of forecasts place Ukraine's budget deficit in the $45 billion region in 2026. The actual number could end up being much higher. And Western pledges up to September only covered $27.4 billion of the deficit. "We've got a situation where there is no money," one Ukrainian official said, "and Europe alone doesn't have the money needed to bring us back to life." Al Jazeera adds to the bleak economic picture in Ukraine, noting that a combination of Ukraine's budget deficit and its public debt are likely to exceed 100% of the country's gross domestic product in 2026. The outlet also notes that the EU has failed to tie the US down to any financial commitments that could help to alleviate these financial concerns for Ukraine. So Ukraine is in desperate need of the loan that the EC is proposing. It will be waiting with bated breath to see if that loan proposal is approved by the majority of the EU nations that will be placed on the hook as guarantors. France is already looking wobbly, but Macron may be brought back around if more pressure is placed upon him. As the New York Times claimed back in November, there appears to be no plan B if the frozen Russian assets aren't used. Some might see the EC's latest plan as a Hail Mary throw to save Ukraine. If it is, then it's a throw that has to be caught. A saving grace for Ukraine is that Russia is struggling just as much on the economic front, which may mean that the war comes down to which country is able to sustain its funds for the longest. Ukraine's strikes against Russian oil, combined with Western sanctions, are turning the economic screw on Putin and his cronies. Something big has already broken in Russia, and Putin is powerless to stop it as he watches his war economy crumble around him. Find out more about the impending financial collapse that Russia faces in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the latest developments with Russia's frozen assets. And thank you as always for watching.